The Awakening, from the Fempiror Chronicles, by George Willson. Chapter 12, The Lost Art of Jijunga. David looked around at the various businesses that lined the streets of Aram. He saw some familiar types of businesses, such as tailors, barbers, and carpenters, and some that were unfamiliar, such as cart repair, swordsmith, and churning pool alignment. Aram appeared to be a very busy place, and it was likely that many of the stores specializing in the items that only the Fempiror possessed could only be found here. He had originally taken the large number of people for granted, as Aram being a town that lived at night. But then the large number started the questions running through his head again. He looked at Zechariah, who continued only to look ahead. He wondered if it was safe to talk to him yet. "So," he began, "if transmutation is illegal, why are there so many Fempiror?" He watched Zechariah's face, hoping Zechariah would not misunderstand his innocent question. "Well, some people do end up going home and successfully convincing their families that becoming a Fempiror to spend their lives together is a good idea," Zechariah replied. "Some of them actually consent to this life before they fully understand it. We don't punish ignorance, but some of those people do regret their choices when they learn the more unkind truths about our existence, especially the problem with sunlight." He looked at David, and his expression had returned to being the kinder old man that had introduced himself to David only a day before. "As to why there are so many, you have to remember that Fempiror live a very long time, so some of these Fempiror have been here for hundreds of years. For another thing, not everyone here is a Fempiror." "They aren't?" David asked with surprise. "No," Zechariah replied. "Humans frequently visit and even live in our town. Most of them don't know everything about us, and we prefer it that way. Some think we're a kind of future town, and don't take any of it seriously. They're always looking for the strings on the levicarts. Some stores are open all day and all night, though. Fempiror owners hire humans to work during the day, and Fempiror work the store at night when they get the majority of their business. Honestly, though, humans are day creatures, and Fempiror are night creatures, so there isn't a great deal of interaction." David looked around at the people walking past him. He never paid attention to them closely at all. He just assumed they were all Fempiror, but as he looked he could not tell who was who in all the bustle of the crowds. He looked back at Zechariah. "How can you tell them apart?" "Why would you need to?" Zechariah responded with a smile. David was speechless. With all the grief Zechariah had given him over going home, and all the fuss he had made over humans not understanding Fempiror, here he was in a place where humanity and the Fempiror peacefully coexisted, however ignorantly the humans may be to doing so. "What about humanity using your levicarts and such?" David asked. "Really, it's never been a problem," Zechariah said with a shrug. "They've been welcome in our town, and they've seen what we can do. They've never bothered to take anything we've created, and most of them prefer to settle down here and never leave anyway. We've occasionally had a levicart disappear, but we've also found it weeks later, intact for the most part. It takes more than just the creation to make another one, David. It also takes the know-how we've spent centuries learning. Even if they did remake it, they couldn't maintain it without help. We don't give them the help." David considered this carefully. If he did take a levicart or one of their lights, he would never be able to make another one, no matter how long he worked at it. He knew something powered the lights to make them light up, but he had no idea what that was. Same with the levicarts. He might be able to run Zechariah's for a while, but what happened if it stopped going? "Here we are," Zechariah said suddenly. David looked up out of his thoughts to see a store called The Lost Art of Jijunga that blended into the rest of the stores in Aram with its gray-on-gray color scheme. The letter design, though in the common language, resembled the Philetarusque character that Zechariah had shown David as they had been traveling. "What's Jijunga?" David asked, pointing to the unfamiliar word on the sign. Zechariah shrugged with a smile. "I really don't know," he said. "Tiberius made it up. I think it's supposed to be some kind of meditation." David stared after Zechariah as he entered the shop. While there were many things Zechariah knew, he was largely unconcerned with the things that he knew nothing about, and he had no problem sharing that he did not know. He wondered for a moment what some of the older women of Hoggenstown would pretend to know about Jijunga before he followed Zechariah inside. They entered a wide-open room with a wooden floor and a large, soft mat that covered almost the entire surface. The back of the room had a single door leading into the rear portion of the building, and David could only guess at how much went on behind that wall. Whatever Tiberius used this space for, it certainly did not look like a store. Hoggenstown had nothing like it, so David could not fathom what it was for. As if on cue, a man walked out of the back room. He looked older than Zechariah did, with short white hair and a white beard neatly trimmed, but dressed as modern as the rest of the town, with brown breeches, tan stockings and shirt, and a brown waistcoat. His shoes, David noticed, were simply tied, like David's were, as opposed to the higher-end buckles that he had seen in a lot of the town. Tiberius was either poor or modest, and as the clothes appeared to be in very good condition, David leaned toward modesty. Upon seeing Zechariah, Tiberius smiled. "Zechariah!" he exclaimed. "How are you doing, Tiberius?" Zechariah asked, moving towards him. They embraced like old friends in a brief hug, continuing to greet each other. Zechariah stepped back, gently grabbed David by the shoulder, and pulled him forward. Tiberius' expression faltered slightly as he looked at the newcomer, but Zechariah remained upbeat. "David, this is Tiberius," Zechariah explained. "He trained and commanded the Rostem for their original battles back in the war. He also served to train or support almost every Rostem since, and most Rostem still look to him as their commander, though he is too humble to admit it." "How do you do?" David greeted Tiberius. Tiberius watched David warily. David averted his eyes uneasily. He glanced at Zechariah, who only nodded towards Tiberius. David looked back at Tiberius, who had not moved. "So, how do you come to be with us, young one?" Tiberius asked. David shifted his feet nervously. Zechariah had not mentioned anything like this would be coming. "Well," David began, "I was walking home, and this man stopped me in the town square. He had taken an older man from our town and had him in this cave out east of town." "By the old mill?" Zechariah spoke up, surprised. David looked at him and nodded. Zechariah shook his head. "There's never been a cave out there." "I know," David said, "but there was the other night. My beloved fell into it through the floor of the mill." "So there was a cave where there wasn't one before," Tiberius clarified. David nodded. "And," Tiberius continued, turning to Zechariah, "you say that there wasn't one there before." "That's right," Zechariah said. Tiberius nodded. "And how long was it since you'd been there, Zechariah?" Zechariah looked away for a moment. He appeared to be thinking very hard about this. Tiberius raised his eyebrows. "Long enough for a Fempiror to dig a cave?" Tiberius asked. "Yes, at least that long," Zechariah replied. Tiberius nodded and paced the floor briefly. David's eyes followed him as he moved. "So, this person you met in the town square that you also saw in this cave that was not there before," Tiberius continued, "what did he do?" David recounted the coldness of the stabbing, the burning of the change, and waking up in Zechariah's room. Tiberius asked further questions to satisfy what David assumed to be suspicions about David turning up the way he did. He turned away from David again when David finished his tale with the entry into Aram. Throughout this, Tiberius did not address Zechariah, nor did he allow Zechariah to respond to David when David asked about certain points of the journey that he did not understand. Tiberius only wanted to know what David knew, without the embellishment of a 400-year-old Fempiror who knew everything already. Suddenly, Tiberius swung his arm around and stopped his fist only inches from David's face. David cringed, but had the blow continued, Tiberius would have hit him. Tiberius relaxed. "Why did you do that?" David asked, surprised. "I wanted to see your reaction," Tiberius said without a trace of humor. "Why?" David asked with more than a hint of disdain in his voice. "Because you have told me that you have been a rather repressed tailor's apprentice your entire life," Tiberius responded. "If you were lying to me, your reflexes as a trained fighter would have taken precedence over this act, and tried to block me. However, you responded like a common person. You did nothing but flinch." "You're convinced?" Zechariah asked. "Indeed," he said, looking at Zechariah. "Well, what do you want to do with him? You've been away from Aram a long time. Did you come back to let me deal with him so you could continue your crusade? Deal with me? David asked in surprise. This boy, and the one who changed him, is more proof of the Tepish return, Zechariah said, his excitement rekindled. Tiberius closed his eyes and shook his head. More Tepish reports, Zechariah. Why do you persist in this? I have spoken to head Korean, and I'm meeting with the council tonight, Zechariah said. Tiberius' eyes widened in disbelief. You called an emergency meeting? Tiberius, the Tepish have returned. This encounter is proof. The encounter will be dismissed as an isolated incident. They need to know. They don't care, Tiberius said, finishing the conversation. Zechariah clenched his fists in frustration. Tiberius' expression remained unchanged. Zechariah, Tiberius said, mere mentions of the Tepish order were outlawed years ago. We have to face this, Zechariah insisted. If we don't, the Tepish way will be law, and our lives won't be the only ones ended. Look, Zechariah, things aren't going well in Aram, Tiberius said. It may not be Tepish related, but lines are being drawn between humans and Fempiror. It's not obvious, but it's happening. There are some who don't even speak to humans. Many of the stores close during the day now. I don't know where this is coming from, but the changing of a boy into a Fempiror won't get you many sympathetic ears, code or no code. Tiberius looked at Zechariah, hopeful that Zechariah might change his mind about the council, but Zechariah remained resolute. Tiberius shook his head. It's too late to stop this, he said, but we might be able to use it to our advantage. Zechariah suddenly turned hopeful. What do you have in mind? He asked. They will make it well known that you were removed from the council for the same presentation that you are making today, Zechariah said. That was not a vain mission, Zechariah chimed in, cutting Tiberius off. We knew that the Tepish emerged and massed at that location. The location had no evidence of habitation, Tiberius reminded Zechariah. In 25 years, no one's found anything, including you. Nothing anyone has lived to tell about, Zechariah said with a grumble. Speak the truth, Zechariah, Tiberius said. If this goes as badly as I suspect it will, and you suggest the Tepish, you'll be captured. If you try to run, they'll get you with chasers. Zechariah looked at him questioningly. Oh yes, Tiberius said, it has been a while, hasn't it? Chasers are like levicarts, but smaller and faster. Everything has changed since you left. Even if they had solid proof, I suspect they'd cover it up. David looked between Tiberius and Zechariah. Zechariah was shaking his head. Excuse me, David said. Tiberius and Zechariah looked at him. Why am I here? I don't wish to be a burden, but if I'm just something to be dealt with, I'd like to know. David, Zechariah sighed, there are dark times ahead. You must have some knowledge of how to defend yourself, or you cannot survive. But I don't belong here, David insisted. Many have come who don't belong, Tiberius said matter-of-factly. Over time, willingly or unwillingly, they learn. It's not that I'm unwilling to learn, it's simply a matter of knowing what is to become of me, David said. Truth be told, he had no interest in fighting. He only wanted to learn what he needed to know to allow him to return home, although he was gathering from Zechariah little by little that day would never come. David looked at Zechariah. You said that we aren't allowed to live among humans until trained and conditioned, David reminded him. So what does that mean? How do I need to be trained and conditioned to be set free? Zechariah nodded to Tiberius. Tiberius walked to a large cylindrical container containing 6 wooden practice swords. Tiberius pulled one of the simply designed swords out of the container. It had a straight hilt that would accommodate 2 hands, a simple crossguard, and a straight cylindrical blade that was roughly 30 inches long. Catch, Tiberius said, and without a pause, tossed it to David. It sailed smoothly through the air, a lazy spin placed on it by Tiberius. David reflexively raised his hand and caught the wooden sword by the hilt, blade standing up. What are we doing? David asked. This was not the churning stick from his lonely alley. This was something more real, more serious. David observed how light and solid it felt in his hand, and part of him liked it. If you think you want to go back home, Tiberius said, which is the intention of most who come into this life unexpectedly, then you need to be ready for what you may come against. You have to know that changing anyone is wrong. You have to be ready to run if attacked, and if it comes to it, fight your way out if cornered. Most importantly, you have to be able to hold your own against someone who intends to transmutate someone illegally. I have no doubts that you can get away from a group of angry humans, but facing off against a member of our own race will take time to learn. Zechariah will most likely perform most of your training in his own time, but we can give you a taste of it here while we have a moment, just to give you an idea of what you're getting into." David felt butterflies in his stomach. He looked at the sword he had caught, much to the satisfaction of the older Fempiror. He nodded nervously. "What you're holding," Tiberius continued, "is a practice longsword. Beginners use them for assaults or arms exercises, so they don't hurt themselves." "Or you?" David asked. Tiberius smiled grimly. "If the thought would make you feel better, then yes." David shook his head. Of course, he would never be able to touch either of these two fighters. He had never held anything like this before, and he would look like a newborn compared to them while attempting to swing it. "The idea behind the wood we use in these is that they don't break during hours of hard practice," Tiberius said, "but I think those of us who have used them have broken at least one." "Or a dozen," Zechariah chimed in. Tiberius nodded with a genuine smile finally. Some of his hard exterior had started to melt away as he spoke, and Zechariah's comment seemed to speed the process a little more. "The sword is the main weapon of the Rostem," Tiberius continued. "It is your defense and your inner strength." He took one of the wooden swords in his right hand and walked back over to stand in front of David. David looked up at him. "Now," Tiberius said, "try to hit me." David looked at the sword in his hand. None of this felt natural, but he felt like he was rather bound to try this exercise in order to try to get back home. He swung the sword lazily in a high forward arc. In a blinding fast move, Tiberius went from standing with the sword relaxed at his side to blocking the blow with ease. "That was nothing," Tiberius said. "You didn't even try." It was true, of course. David had just swung the sword not knowing anything about what he was doing. He swung it again, a little harder this time. Again, Tiberius blocked it. "Better," Tiberius said, "but really put your strength into it. You've got a lot more of it now, and you're barely tapping into it. You can even dig into some of that anger and frustration I'm sure you have about losing everything." Tiberius was right about the anger and frustration he had been suppressing. He took a couple more swings. Tiberius blocked both of them easily again. "Come on," Tiberius urged. "Really hit me." David tried again, this time swinging harder. Tiberius stopped every single blow. The one-sided assault was wearing on David. He swung faster and harder, putting himself into it now. "Good," Tiberius said between blocks. "Very good. Now we're getting somewhere. You still can't hit me, though." David stopped for a moment, breathing heavily. Tiberius gestured for David to come at him. With a roar, David swung hard and fast against Tiberius. He was kicking more dust off his clothes into a small cloud around them. Blow after blow fell furiously against Tiberius' blocks, which David could still not get through. Now he was getting frustrated. He noted that he was backing Tiberius toward a wall of the shop, and the old man appeared to be getting a little concern etched in his face. David had youth on his side and struck even harder. He finally had Tiberius against a wall. He was going to win this. Without warning, Tiberius struck back. In one move, Tiberius knocked David's sword out of the way and touched the blunt tip of the wooden sword gently against David's chest. David stood still, completely stunned as to how a fight he thought he was winning had turned so suddenly. "What happened?" David asked. "I fought back," Tiberius said simply. "I think you missed that all I had done to that point was block you. Swinging is easy. Stopping the swing is what takes skill." Tiberius took a wide swing at David. David moved the sword and blocked him. Tiberius smiled. "Very good." Tiberius and David turned to Zechariah to find they had another visitor. Standing next to Zechariah, David could see that the visitor was taller, with slim, chiseled features, a small mouth, and deep blue eyes behind which seemed to hide many mysteries. His white hair was trimmed short, and he was clean-shaven, a stark contrast to the wild, unkempt look of Zechariah. He was dressed as what could only be a member of the council, in a long blue velvet robe with yellow embroidery descending in a V-shape from his neck to about 2/3 of the way down the front of the robe. The sleeves were long and wide. His hat was made of the same fabric as the robe, and was a simple flat crown style with no brim. "David," Tiberius said with a smile, This is Vladimir, a Rostim who fought by our side back in the Fileterusk War, and a member of the council, as you can probably see." Vladimir looked very amused by the assault David had just had with Tiberius. "You know, Tiberius," Vladimir said, "if you were looking for an easy fight, I could have brought Jarvis in here, and it would have at least looked legitimate." Having met Jarvis, David could not help but chuckle at the jab Vladimir had clearly made against head Korean's assistant. Tiberius and Zechariah laughed as well. "No, I was just introducing Zechariah's young friend here to swordplay," Tiberius said. "Mind if I have a go?" Vladimir asked. "I want to make sure I don't get beaten by a young one." "Well," Tiberius said, "I'm a little winded, but perhaps Zechariah can provide a formidable opponent for you. It'll also let David see some action between some real fighters." Vladimir turned to Zechariah with a smile. "All right, Zechariah, shall we see how rusty you've gotten out there in Hoggenstown?" "Do you think you can finally beat him?" Tiberius asked. Vladimir smiled confidently, almost cocky. "I keep up my training," he said. "Vladimir's been trying to beat me for years," Zechariah said to David. "He's never been able to do it." "And maybe today's my day," Vladimir said. Tiberius tossed the wooden sword to Vladimir as David handed his to Zechariah. Vladimir caught Tiberius' sword easily and twirled it with that same cocky confidence around his fingers before settling it into his hand. Zechariah, by contrast, only held the sword at his side, making Vladimir's hand tricks seem interesting, but David wondered if the tricks translated into skill. "How are you lately?" Zechariah asked Vladimir as they walked to the center of the room. "Disturbed, I would say," Vladimir said seriously. "I received an urgent communication stating a Code 57 meeting was called for tonight. I knew only the great Zechariah would do such a thing. In fact, he's the only one outside the council who knows what one is." "How long have you been on the council?" Zechariah asked. "I replaced you 25 years ago," Vladimir replied. "It reduced the brunt of your loss." "Really?" Zechariah said, surprised. "You know, in all this time no one has ever mentioned you were on the council, not even when I approached them 15 years ago. There were only 6 members present for that meeting, so I assume you were unable to attend." "Yes," Vladimir said, "I was away, but I heard about your performance. I hope we're not in for a repeat. No one will appreciate it." "Why do you think no one told me you were on the council?" Zechariah asked, throwing a glance toward Tiberius. "I can only guess no one knew that you didn't know," Vladimir suggested. "I thought you knew," Tiberius said. Zechariah nodded. "I understand Aram is not what it was," he said warily. "Many new faces," Vladimir said, "some not to be trusted. If you are back with more Tepish evidence, your voice will fall on deaf ears." Zechariah shook his head. "I have to try," he said desperately. "If I do nothing, how am I upholding the Rostem Code? He doesn't deserve to be like us." Zechariah indicated David standing next to Tiberius as they waited for the fight to begin. Vladimir looked at David and smiled. "Ah, yes, we're showing off for the new one," Vladimir said. "I believe that was the idea," David piped up. Zechariah smirked. He and Vladimir looked at each other. They raised their swords vertically in a brief salute before dropping into a defensive stance. They circled carefully, deliberately. They stared into each other's eyes, each one waiting for the other to open themselves up with some kind of attack. Tiberius leaned over to David. "They're waiting for the other one to go first," Tiberius said quietly. "It's one of my rules. When possible, don't make the first move. It only leaves you open for an easy retaliation." David nodded, never taking his eyes from the circling combatants. Vladimir smiled. "After you," he said. "I don't think so," Zechariah said, shaking his head. Vladimir finally made the first move, and the fight was on. To an outsider, the fight would appear impossibly fast. The two wooden swords slammed together over and over again with ferocity. Vladimir made several offensive swings, but Zechariah blocked each one skillfully, and one might even say easily. Zechariah blocked a blow and moved into the offensive, giving a swift stab. Vladimir successfully deflected Zechariah's sword and tried to swing forward to regain his offensive position, but Zechariah quickly recovered and not only deflected the blow, but forced Vladimir to continue defending himself. Zechariah's blows continued so swiftly that Vladimir found himself backed against a wall, defending himself against Zechariah's building onslaught. Zechariah took a final swing, missing Vladimir's face by inches. The follow-through of the swing caught Vladimir's sword and threw it out the front window, shattering it. Vladimir looked into Zechariah's face. Zechariah looked amused as he held the practice sword in a kill position over Vladimir. Vladimir forced out a little smile. "All right," he sighed. "You win." Zechariah tossed the sword to Tiberius, who caught it easily with a look of amusement. "Sorry about the window, Tiberius," Zechariah said. Tiberius shrugged. "Don't worry about it, Zechariah," he said. "It's not the first time I've lost a window to a sword. I really should consider reinforcing it." Vladimir regained the regal stance he entered with, smoothing out his robes and correcting his hat. "Well," he said, "that was interesting." Zechariah gave him a wry smile. "I win again," he said. "Someday I'll beat you. You're the only one I never have. If I ever get maimed, we'll have another go." "Zechariah," Vladimir began with a more serious tone, "I'm not here for a friendly visit. I have come personally to talk you out of this meeting." Zechariah looked at Vladimir suspiciously. "How did you know you'd find me here?" he asked. Vladimir smiled. "Your friends in Aram are limited, my old friend," he said. "I knew when I heard of the order that only one person would have done it. I also knew that this one person would only go to one other person while here, especially having heard that he had a new Fempiror with him. Zechariah would follow the rules implicitly, and take his new person to the one who trained him. It was the only logical conclusion." "I haven't found a reason to change my habits," Zechariah said, nodding. "So again, I have to ask you not to follow through with this meeting," Vladimir pleaded. "Zechariah," Tiberius said, stepping in, "I know many Rostem who would be willing to investigate this without the knowledge of the council. Vladimir is one of those." "Really?" Zechariah asked. "It's unusual and even frowned upon for a council member to act independently of the council's knowledge, especially for something like this." "This is a dark time we live in," Tiberius said. "Despite my political position," Vladimir said, "I believe there is a threat." "But once a Code 57 is issued," Zechariah reminded him, "it cannot be retracted." "You could leave town first," Vladimir suggested. Zechariah looked surprised that Vladimir would even suggest such a course of action. "I will not damage my honor," Zechariah said, shaking his head. "All the same," Vladimir began, but Zechariah interrupted. "David was changed into a Fempiror by a Tepish," Zechariah said. "A Tepish who said he was an acquisition ranked Redel Kurtz. He even used a Neilroth to do it." "Used a what?" David asked. He had been simply listening to the conversation and trying to keep up, but he was getting lost in the strange words, and he wanted to know what a Neilroth was. The older Fempiror turned to him. "A Neilroth," Zechariah said. "And did you bring it with you?" Vladimir asked. "I did," Zechariah said. "Or rather, what's left of it." "Really?" Vladimir said. He sounded genuinely surprised. "Let's see it." Zechariah opened the satchel he had strapped to his waist. He removed a small metal object that had a pair of sharp points at one end and that appeared to have been thoroughly trampled. Vladimir raised his eyebrows and looked at Zechariah. "That's it," he said. Zechariah shrugged. "The rogue dropped it when I threw him off of David. When I fought him, this was on the ground and fared no better than he did." Vladimir shook his head. "I know why you brought it, but I would suggest sparing yourself the embarrassment of showing that in front of the council. If it were still intact, you might have a chance of convincing them. But in its current state—" Zechariah nodded. "That's what I was afraid of," he sighed. "Still, better to have brought it for the second opinion than to leave it behind and wonder. Besides, I couldn't risk someone pricking their finger for an accidental transmutation." "I'm glad you sought a second opinion on at least one point," Vladimir said with a smile. Zechariah chuckled. He replaced the Neilroth, closed the satchel, and looked at Tiberius. "Tiberius, do you still have that intact Neilroth?" Tiberius nodded. "Why would he have one?" David asked aside to Zechariah. "I had come across one many years ago," Tiberius answered. "Since I tend to see a lot of new Fempiror, I decided to hold on to it to clarify whether the person who was changed had ever seen one, so we would know whether there was possible Tepish involvement. I'll be right back." Tiberius turned and walked into the back of the building. Vladimir shook his head. "The existence of a Tepish device doesn't necessarily mean that the order is returning," he challenged. Whatever it means, Zechariah returned, the rogue referenced the Tepish, used Tepish equipment, carried out Tepish ideologies, and claimed to be of the second rung of the Tepish hierarchy. Whether we want to admit it or not, someone is reviving the Order of Tepish. It must be stopped. Tiberius re-entered the room carrying a small, unadorned wooden box. He handed it to Zechariah. "I remember when you first produced this device," Zechariah said to Tiberius. "I was surprised that one had been found so long after the decimation of the Tepish order. The contents of this box actually started the obsession that led to my separation from the council and my rather voluntary exile to the Hoggenstown area." Zechariah opened the box to reveal the silver Neurov with the pair of needles manufactured by the Tepish, specifically to look like sharp teeth. The glass tube stored in the device had long since been cleaned of the Fempiror blood that a Tepish would normally have inside it. David shuddered. This was the first sign to me that the Tepish were researching their own ideas and finding ways to bring their philosophical vengeance to the world, Zechariah said. "So they just used it to pull out their own blood and put it into others?" David asked. "And that changes someone?" The three elder Fempiror nodded. "Other than their own blood," Tiberius said, "the Tepish also used what they called a dissipator fluid, which causes all the water in their intended victim's blood to evaporate. All we ever saw were the after effects, but it couldn't have been a pleasant death. The victims of this death looked shriveled, as if they'd been dead for days instead of hours. When we first discovered victims of the dissipator fluid, we didn't know what to make of the strangely shriveled corpses, and were more surprised when, after cutting into the victims' veins, that powder poured out instead of blood. It didn't take us long to find that the powder was the victim's blood, stripped of all the water." David looked at the Neurov in the box, and shivered not only at the memory of the burning sensation from that night, but the idea that they not only used their own blood, but other fluids they had created to kill people. David pointed to the fanged ends of the Neurov. "That's why I have 2 marks where I got injected," he asked. "Like a pair of fangs?" "The Tepish perpetuate the popular vampire myth," Tiberius explained. "This device not only injects our blood as the serum to cause the change, but reinforces the myth that the victims are bitten in order to do so. The dissipator fluid created the illusion that someone had drained or drank the victim's blood. We're fortunate in that the dissipator fluid hasn't been used in a couple hundred years." "All this is beside the point. This meeting will not go well," Vladimir said suddenly, returning to the reason he had come. "I fear for you, old friend." "When the inevitable comes," Tiberius said, "meet me at the safe house in Karebdim. We'll work out what to do from there." "I'll try to keep the council from searching there," Vladimir assured them, "but I won't be able to hold them off for long. I'll try to meet you there as well." Vladimir took a step toward the door. "I'll see you at the meeting. Until then, Zechariah." Zechariah nodded. "Until then," he said. Vladimir left the building and walked past the group of people looking at the broken window. Tiberius stood next to Zechariah as they watched him go. "Can we trust him?" Zechariah asked. "You would know better than I, Zechariah," Tiberius replied. "You are friends from before you were Fempiror, fought side by side as soldiers, and were changed together." "Yes, but after my removal we lost touch," Zechariah said with concern in his voice. "We always followed the same ideological path, so with him on the council I feel like there's someone there I can trust. But is he really, or was he selected as my replacement for reasons only the council knows?" "I'm afraid I can't answer that for you," Tiberius said. Zechariah nodded, and they spoke no more of it.